of course, Revelation is a very disputed book in the New Testament, one of the most disputed interpretively. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Who wrote the book? That's disputed. I think John the Apostle wrote the book. Many think that the different style of the book rules out apostolic authorship, but I think the different style can be attributed to the fact that the book is apocalyptic, about which we'll say more momentarily. He wrote it from the Isle of Patmos, where he was presumably imprisoned, and he wrote that the date next. He wrote it either 90 to 95 AD or the late 60s. So most argue, I think the best evidence supports a later date, 90 to 95 AD. That's the consensus. I don't know if you know about the preterist view. I'll say more about it in a little bit. The evangelical preterist view of Revelation. R.C. Sproul, for example, is an evangelical preterist. But one of the problems with the preterist view is they have to have an early date because they pin a lot on AD 70. And that's an interesting thing to have an early date for your interpretation to be sustained. And that's a very controversial matter. Kenneth Gentry has written a whole book on this, on why Revelation is earlier. But I think his argument is disputable and ultimately not convincing. So, I don't want my interpretation to depend upon the dating of a book such as this, and I think that's a problem with the preterist view. What's the situation of the book? Clearly, it's persecution. It isn't empire-wide persecution, but it is bloody persecution. It's sporadic. Most would agree it's sporadic persecution, and I've just listed for you the passages where we have John in prison, Antipas is killed, there's a trial on the whole earth, there's the martyrs under the altar. Clearly they've been put to death for Christ. Babylon, we're told 3 times that Babylon has poured out the blood of God's people or drunk from the blood of the saints. I mean, again, most preterists say that Babylon is Jerusalem. I think that's really improbable. I think it's quite clear that Babylon is Rome. So that Babylon stands for the city of Rome. Hopefully we'll say more about this. In 19:2, God avenges the blood of his servants. And then in chapter 20, verse 4, he speaks of martyrs being beheaded. So what we see in Revelation is Christians are being put to death. This book has always been very precious to the suffering church and still is today. As you all know, some of our brothers and sisters, even today, are being put to death for the sake of Jesus. And they love and treasure this book, and for good reason. Of course, it still speaks to us as well, even if we're not physically persecuted. What's the genre of the book? What kind of book is it? When it comes to genre, Revelation is a combination of genres. It's clearly prophecy. He tells us that in 1:3. I could have referred to other verses. I just referred to one here. It's also epistolary, right? Chapters 2 and 3 are letters. So you have an epistolary genre in chapter 2 and 3. But most significantly, the letter is apocalyptic. So here's my definition of apocalyptic. Apocalyptic is a supernatural unveiling. By the way, that's what the word apocalypse means, to unveil, right? A supernatural unveiling of what is about to take place. A divine disclosure, usually via angels. You have a divine disclosure, usually via angels, to some prominent person in which God promises to intervene in human history, to destroy evil, and to bring in his kingdom. So that's a start. Then I added the definition of apocalyptic from the Apocalypse Seminar of the SPL. This is not an inspired document. This is done by a committee, so it probably doesn't rank as great literature. But I do want to say this. You know that if these people met for years as a seminar and discussed apocalyptic, So every word of this definition was debated. It's a very, very carefully formulated definition, and I think it's helpful for us. Some of the features of this definition don't fit Revelation, but overall it's helpful. So here we go. Apocalypse is a genre of revelatory literature with a narrative framework. So all that's true of Revelation, isn't it? In which a revelation is mediated by an otherworldly being, in the case of Revelation, an angel, to a human recipient, John, disclosing a transcendent reality, right? Transcendent means something that is above our world, right? Above and beyond our world, which is both temporal insofar as it envisages eschatological salvation. So there's a temporal framework, a story, right? And spatial insofar as it involves another supernatural world. You think of Revelation of the New Jerusalem coming down, right? You have a spatial reality and temporal. Apocalypse was intended to interpret present earthly circumstances. That's certainly true in Revelation. How do we interpret our suffering? In light of the supernatural world and of the future, and to influence both the understanding and the behavior of the audience by means of divine authority. So I think that's a very good definition, and it's helpful. But now let's just be a little more specific. Let's think of some characteristics of apocalyptic. One is historical dualism. Historical dualism ought to be distinguished from ontological dualism, right? What is ontological dualism? That would be the conception that Satan and God are equal ontologically, equally strong supernatural beings. Obviously, that's unbiblical, isn't it? Satan, with all his power, is a created being. But historically, there's a dualistic story, right? There's a battle between God and Satan, and you see that, between good and evil. Then in apocalyptic, you see visions. Of course, all of Revelation is a vision given to John, isn't it? Typically, apocalyptic is pseudonymous. So we can think of other books. I have some of them listed. First Enoch. Nobody thinks First Enoch was written by the historical Enoch. Second Baruch. This is the Baruch mentioned in Jeremiah. Nobody thinks Second Baruch, which is a pseudepigraphal book, was written by Baruch. Fourth Esdras, another pseudepigraphal book. No one believes Ezra wrote that book. So typically, apocalyptic literature is pseudonymous. But Revelation is clearly an exception. All scholars agree it's an exception. All scholars agree that the author identifies himself as John. Now, they don't all agree it's John the Apostle, because he doesn't actually say, I'm John the Apostle, do you see? But everybody agrees that whoever wrote this, his name was John. John who? Well, John the Apostle. Symbolism. So Revelation is marked by symbolism, isn't it? So that makes it tricky. I was raised and trained. I'm not raised because I don't mean as a young child because I was raised as a Catholic, but as a new Christian, I was trained by dispensationalists. And when I went to seminary, they argued that you ought to take the literal meaning if at all possible. And I believed that for a while, but not for very long, because it doesn't take you very long to think that's cheating, right? That's cheating. And I respect my teachers so much. Why is that cheating? You can't set the rules in advance, right? You can't say that, because what if the author intends to write symbolically? So you can't say in advance it's got to be literal. That has to be decided by interpretation. It's harder than that, isn't it? It's more of an art than that. You can't decide the rules of the game before you start playing the game. In this case, interpreting a piece of literature. You have to decide whether it's symbolic or not. And then even once you decide that, well, is this passage symbolic, and what's it symbolic of? So we're plunged into the art of interpretation. But the point to make here is apocalyptic is marked by symbolism. And it's marked by numerology. Big numbers are significant. I would argue numbers are symbolic. So you see, interpretive frameworks come to the fore here. Do you think these numbers are literal or symbolic? You have to make up your mind. Good Christians disagree. Good evangelicals disagree on this. A focus on angelology. and demonology and predicted woes. And then I already mentioned, I just put down some apocalyptic books. There are features in the Old Testament that are apocalyptic. You think of Zechariah 9 through 14 is very apocalyptic in its style. Parts of Ezekiel are very apocalyptic. Parts of Daniel. So it isn't as if it first came into being when we come to Revelation. It was around. So here's a key feature in interpreting Revelation, right? In popular evangelical circles, in which I was nurtured as a new Christian, for which I'm thankful, but popular evangelical circles that are very eschatologically driven, they interpret Revelation via what I call newspaper eschatology. So they read the newspaper and the contemporary events, and they interpret Revelation accordingly. And Hal Lindsey, for example, he makes this very plain. He just says the original readers couldn't understand Revelation. Only we can understand it because we're living in the days when what is predicted there is being fulfilled. So that's basically an admission, isn't it? A forthright statement, so he's not hiding it, of a hermeneutical framework. What's the key to interpreting Revelation? Why it's contemporary events. They unlock the key to Revelation. But I want to suggest just the opposite, that the first readers understood this book. I'm not saying every detail, right? Paul wrote some things hard to understand, but it was written to them, and this apocalyptic genre was clear to them. They didn't struggle with it because it was common in that day. So they didn't read Revelation and think, that is totally bizarre. What's he talking about? I mean, we don't get it. I think they read Revelation and said, yeah, we understand this. We resonate with this kind of literature. One of the problems, as I'm sure you know, with newspaper eschatology. By the way, not all dispensationalists follow newspaper eschatology, right? I mean, someone like Bruce Ware, he doesn't interpret it that way, for example. So I'm not saying everybody of that persuasion does so. But it is. But the president of Dallas Seminary, John Wolverine, did that. When I forget which time it was, but when Saddam Hussein was active, he wrote some books seeing the fulfillment of Revelation and Saddam and what was happening in Iraq and Iran. And the problem with newspaper eschatology is, right, the news moves on. When I was young, it was the 10 nations of the common market. I mean, maybe people are still saying that, but of course they have more than 10. So it just moves on, or it's it's Gog and Magog as the former Soviet Union, and the 200 million, that's China, and so forth and so on. I mean, one of the interesting things is it gets refracted through American political understandings as well, as our political opponents change, so does the interpretation of the book. That seems like a little bit of a problem, don't you think? So, one of the benefits, I suppose, of having engaged in this really since 1948 when Israel became a nation is they've been wrong so many times now that people are a little more chastened about this, I think. But you never know. I mean, I was listening to a radio program, this is a number of years ago, and someone saw, did I mention this in here before? Someone saw some prophecy in people walking on the moon. I mean, fulfilled. I can't remember the text, but I'm sure it's there somewhere. But that was a joke, but sorry. Really a terrible one. All right. Theories of interpretation. What are some theories of interpretation? What are the popular theories? So, preterist, historicist, idealist, and futurist. The preterist view, preterist basically means past, right? It's a fancy word for past. That the book is fulfilled entirely or mainly in AD 70. So AD 70 is a very important date because that's the date when Jerusalem was destroyed. in fulfillment of Jesus' prediction. You know, the preterist view rightly sees that date as a very significant date, and I think that's a benefit. The preterist view is also very helpful in that it's interpreting the book, right, so that the first readers understood it and resonated with it. So there's huge strengths in the preterist view. It locates the book in the first century reality in which it was written. But I already pointed out, at least most preterists, you know, it depends on the book being written before AD 70, which is speculative. Also, there's two different divisions in the preterist view. There's the liberal preterists and there's the evangelical preterists. The liberal preterists say it was written to the first century, it was all to be fulfilled in the first century, and John was wrong. Jesus said, I'm coming soon. He didn't. The prophecy is wrong. It's flawed. It saw the end times as coming in Jesus' day, and it didn't happen. So that's the liberal view. The evangelical view sees nearly all of Revelation fulfilled in AD 70, except the second coming of Jesus, although some of them even interpret the coming passages as relating to what happened in AD 70. It gets sort of interesting at that point. I would just say, I don't see the fulfillment of the passages of Jesus coming in AD 70. I don't think that's persuasive at all. And I think preterists get offended when I say this, but I'm not a dispensationalist and I'm not a preterist, and I think preterists and dispensationalists have the same hermeneutic. In other words, I think both of them interpret the book too literally. And so they're at different ends of the spectrum, but it's the same problem. For example, if you read this 4 views book on Revelation, or 3 views, however many were in it, the preterist advocate in there, and I read it a long time ago, so I can't remember his name, but the preterist advocate in that book, I think he just forces Josephus and the War of AD 70, which Josephus wrote about. You know Josephus, the Jewish historian? So he wrote about the war in AD 70 in which Jerusalem was destroyed. I just felt like he forced Josephus into Revelation to make it fit. Well, in my view, that's somewhat similar to what dispensationalists do. You have the same kind of hermeneutic where things are forced to make them fit. So I think the preterist view has strengths, but I also think it has significant weaknesses. The historicist view is kind of a curiosity today. The historicist view sees Revelation as fulfilled all through history. So in the historicist view, you say the first church, the early church was like the church in Ephesus, really started strong and then it lost its first love. And then we are the Laodicean church, you see? So you march all through history and then you find the church that was like the Philadelphia church, that's the missionary church. You know, maybe that was the 1900s or whatever. Do you see what I'm saying? You just go in chronological order with the 7 letters. The problem with that view, I think, is twofold. Number one, those were written to real cities. Do you see what they're doing? They're saying the Laodicean church is fundamentally about us. No, it was about them. It was about the Laodicean church, which existed in modern-day Turkey 2,000 years ago. And secondly, it's just extremely arbitrary, right? I mean, whatever the last part of history is, that's the Laodicean church. So it's extremely arbitrary to try to carve up history chronologically with the 7 letters. So that view has basically lost favor today. I've never met any person advocating that anymore, but you may run across it. You know, every strange theory out there, you're going to run across, if you live long enough, somewhere, at some place. It's there somewhere out there. And you never know. I'll tell a little story here about years ago, before I came to seminary, Diane and I were having a little Bible study in our house, and we invited our mail carrier to come. We were studying 1 John. Well, he was like a radical, wacko dispensationalist, okay? So we're reading it, and he said, this letter is not for us. this letter is not for the Church of Jesus Christ. I'd never even heard of that before. I'm like, what? No, this letter is not for Christians. This letter is for Jews. So we ought not to be studying it, I guess. What are we doing, wasting our time reading this thing? So, not even no mainstream dispensationalist believes that, but right, he was a nice guy, but that's pretty wacko, isn't it? That 1 John isn't for us. Well, the historicist view, I'm not saying it's exactly wacko, but it's like one thing from wacko. So anyway, don't tweet that, please. Then the idealist view says the book is fundamentally symbolic. So that we ought not to press the details of the book. Now, I'm an idealist. I mean, Greg Beale's commentary, if you know of his commentary, is an idealist. So I hold to the idealist view. But the idealist view can be too vague, right? That's the weakness of the idealist view. That it becomes just God wins, evil loses. There's a little more than that. Of course, there's a little more in Beale's view than that, too. But at least that can be the weakness of the idealist view. But I'm fundamentally an idealist because I think the book is symbolic. And then there's the futurist view, very popular in dispensationalism especially, but in other camps as well. The book is mainly about the future. I think there's truth in this view. So I'm not a dispensationalist. I'm making that clear, aren't I? But I think there's truth in the preterist view, right? It was written in the 1st century. I think there's significant truth in the idealist view, but I also think there's truth in the futurist view. So I think a combination is best of those three views because it does relate, not all of it, but it does also relate in significant ways to the future. What is the main purpose of Revelation? I would argue that the main purpose is so that we could have prophecy charts to make the days pass when we're bored, Obviously, the main purpose isn't that. The main purpose is to encourage the suffering church. Right? So to encourage believers who are suffering that ultimately God will triumph and they will triumph. So the book is very practical, isn't it? And it isn't as common in evangelicalism anymore, although it's still there, where, when I was young, or maybe I'm just not in these circles, they just have prophecy conferences. And at these prophecy conferences, basically, all they do is talk about how to unravel all this stuff, but not a lot of application, just information. But that's not why Revelation was written, to give us information fundamentally. Of course, you can't be encouraged without some truth, but it was written for a practical reason, fundamentally. What's the structure of the book? I think this little box is more helpful actually than my outline because you can kind of see it more easily. So I like this little box. So you have the letters to the 7 churches. Then you have chapters 4 and 5, the throne room vision. Then chapters 6 and 7, you have the 7 seals. 8 through 11, the 7 trumpets. 12 through 14, the woman and the serpent. 15 and 16, the 7 bowls. 17, 1 through 19:10, the fall of Babylon. And 19:11 through 22:21, Jesus comes, the 1,000 years, and the new heavens and the new earth. Now, of course, that's a little bit overly simplistic, but I think it helps to think in big categories when we look at a book like this. Interestingly, in the book, there's 7 blessings. So I think we're not going to look at those, but I think that's symbolic. That 7-fold repetition in Revelation, I think these come from Jim Hamilton. Then the promises to the overcomers. So we'll look at that again. But notice, we'll look at some of these as we march through the book, but notice that in every one of the 7 letters, you have a promise to the overcomer, and also we have promises these promises are fulfilled in the new creation, Hamilton points out. Again, this comes from Jim. You have the promises to the overcomers, and those promises are fulfilled in the new creation. And we'll land on a couple of these as we march through the book. Then lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. What I want to point out here is in 8:5, in that little box, 8:5, 11, 19, and 16, 18, you have that after the seventh seal, after the seventh trumpet, and after the seventh bowl. So I'm going to argue all of those designate the end of history. So maybe I should say that now. So what we see in Revelation is a recursive pattern, recapitulation. John gives us pictures of history, and he comes to the end, and then he starts over again. You see? That's really important for my interpretation of the letter and the interpretation of many. It isn't a book that tells you the whole story beginning to the end. It starts and stops. It starts, goes to the end, starts again. So you kind of circle around, right? Circle back, I should say, to what you just talked about from another perspective. What I think is interesting about that's sort of how he writes 1 John, right? In an epistolary mode. He circles back to those same themes over and over again and looks at them from a different angle. Well, Revelation is written like that as well, but in an apocalyptic genre. So we're very used to reading this book in a linear way, but I would argue that we're being invited by the author not to read it that way. That doesn't contradict what I said earlier about a narrative framework. There's still a story. When I say linear way, I mean from beginning to end. There's a story here, right? And clearly, by the time we get to Revelation 21 and 22, that's the end expanded upon more. But there's starting and stopping. William Hendrickson wrote a book on Revelation that I think is still really worth buying and reading. I don't agree with every detail, but it's a really simple book called More Than Conquerors by William Hendrickson, More Than Conquerors. And Hendrickson argues the book starts and stops 7 times, which is a very attractive idea because the number 7. So if you want to read a kind of a simple portrayal of Revelation, Hendrickson is great. By the way, Greg Beale, from the all-millennial perspective, has written this huge commentary, but now he has a shorter one out. The shorter one's 550 pages, But the longer one, when he finished that longer one, I said, Greg, maybe you should write up something a little more brief. And he goes, why? I said, well, maybe they'll help the ordinary pastor and teacher, But he has a shorter commentary out now that is very good as well. They're both just excellent. From the all-millennial perspective, maybe that is the most intellectually hefty volume. But if you want to read a historic premill, a good representation of the historic premill view, which I'll talk more about, Grant Osborne from Trinity in the Baker series has a nice historic premill view. George, if you want a shorter, you think, I want shorter historic premill. You can read George Ladd. George Ladd is a shorter, briefer historic premill. If you want to read dispensational premill, if you want longer, you can get Robert Thomas, 2 or 3 volumes from Master's Seminary. If you want shorter, you can read Paige Patterson. Have you heard that name? President of Southwestern. So Paige Patterson in the NAC series. If you want a shorter Amill than Beale, you have Dennis Thompson's Triumph of the Lamb. That's a very nice treatment of Revelation. And I'm writing, basically I've written a little commentary on Revelation. It'd be about 300 pages probably, but it's going to appear in the Crossway 12-volume commentary in the Bible, which they say will come out in the year probably 2099. I'm kidding. So who knows when it'll come out. I just hope it comes out before the second coming. So actually, I should really wish for the second coming first, shouldn't I? But anyway. Maybe we'll come back to some of these boxes. Yeah, let's see. Yeah, I think we'll come back to those.